Good evening and welcome. How did we get here? We began at Sinai and continue in cyberspace. How did this come to be? In our class today, we're going to discuss what the Torah, Mishna, and Gemara are, who are the famous commentators Rashi and Tosfos. Together we'll discuss how the Jewish people migrated from Israel to Babylonia and then to the west, throughout Europe and Egypt, Tunis. And we'll discuss how the Torah was passed down from generation to generation and how we have the ability to innovate and understand the Torah. Throughout the class, this is an interactive class. If there's any questions, please feel free to email them to classes@jnet.org. That's classes@jnet.org. And throughout the class, we'll be answering the questions. Our story takes us back 2,000 years. There's a group of Talmudic rabbis sitting together in Israel. They're having a discussion inside of this house, and they're discussing an oven. Is this oven of discussion, is it pure or is it impure? You have all the leading rabbis at the time saying it's 100% impure. And you have Rabbi Eliezer saying it's 100% pure. So you have the majority saying it's impure, and you have Rabbi Eliezer saying it's 100% pure. Okay, what are you going to do? You're Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says, you know what I'll do? He turns to the rabbis and he says, listen, if I am correct, I'll bring you a proof. You see this carob tree right here? This carob tree will prove how the halacha is, how the law is like me. And in an instant, the carob tree moves 100 cubits, 150 feet. Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, clear proof. And the Torah scholars say, 1 second. You're mixing in a carob tree. Where does a carob tree come into our discussion? The carob tree, how is that going to make the halachic ruling? So Rabbi Eliezer says, okay. If my view of the law that the oven is pure is correct, then this aqueduct that you see right here with water, it's going to prove the truth. And all of a sudden, the aqueduct starts going backwards. And so Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, so now we see. And everyone again turns to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, no. How is this aqueduct taking a part in our discussion? Since when does it have any knowledge of what the Torah law is? And Rabbi Eliezer, he listens and he says, okay, if the halacha is like I am saying, if the Torah law is like I am saying, then let this house that we are currently situated in prove. And all of a sudden the house starts to collapse. And again, everyone turns to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, Rabbi Eliezer, how is this house a proof? What knowledge, what insight does this house have that it's going to prove the halacha, the Torah law? And finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, if I am correct, let heaven agree. And all of a sudden, a voice comes out from heaven. And the voice says, what do you want of Rabbi Eliezer? The law is like he says. Oh boy, heaven itself is agreeing with Rabbi Eliezer, so that's it. Okay, we now have clarity who the halacha, who the law is like. And all of a sudden, Rabbi Yeshua stands up and he says, no. Torah loy b'shamayim, he says, 1 second. The Torah is not in heaven. God gave it to us on earth. And in the Torah it says that acharei rabim lehatois, that if in a matter of dispute, we go after the majority. And in this case, yes, heaven may agree with you. But the majority here on earth thinks otherwise. And that's what they did. They did not follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, although heaven had agreed. And they ruled that this oven is impure. A little while later, Rabbi Nassan, a scholar at the time, he meets Elijah the prophet. And he asks Elijah, and he says, Eliyahu HaNavi, at the time that this discussion was happening, when heaven said one thing and yet the Talmudic scholars on earth said otherwise, what was Hashem, what was God's response? Incredible. Listen to this. Elijah says, Eliyahu says, Hashem smiled. And he said, Nitzchoni b'ni, Nitzchoni, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed. They've been victorious. They're 100% correct. Wow. Wow. Heaven is saying one thing, and yet we here, all of you that are listening to this to this talk, any Jewish person in the world has power to innovate in Torah, and yet the heavens don't have a say in the Torah law. Incredible. Our ability, the trust that God has in us, it's tremendous. But what is this story? What happened from Mount Sinai when we received the Torah in the year 2448? When at that time we got the Torah scroll. What happened until today, when today we have this influx, thank God, of thousands, tens of thousands of Torah books? How did this journey happen? How did this all come to be? Before we continue, again, if there's any questions, please go ahead and email them to classes@jnet.org. Additionally, online, you could see there's a wonderful handout, and please follow along as we go through it. It's for you to follow along and be able to pay it better focus and understand. 2448, the Torah is given at Mount Sinai. What exactly is given at Mount Sinai? In 2 days, on Shavuos, this Sunday, everyone should try to be in shul and hear the 10 Commandments read. But what was given exactly at Mount Sinai? What did Moshe receive? On your map in the handout, on the second page, there's a map, and you can actually see there's a letter C, a yellow C in the Sinai desert. It's towards the south, and that is Har Sinai. On this mountain, the Torah was given. Moshe went up for 40 days and 40 nights. What did he receive at this time? Well, text number one. Text number one reads, every commandment that God gave to Moshe, that means every mitzvah, every one of the 613 mitzvot, was given with all its details. That means if there's a mitzvah to put up a mezuzah on the wall, so then all the details of that mitzvah were given. God would say the commandment and then say its details and idea. So what we have clarity is that what was given at Mount Sinai is certainly, of course, the 10 Commandments, but in addition to that, the 613 mitzvot with all of its details. But we don't know, or seemingly it's not clear right now, about everything else. Did God give the Talmud? Did God give the Mishna? And additionally, we're going to see in a moment, did God give the completed Torah? When was the completed Torah, the Torah scroll, with all 53 parshiyot, all 53 sections, when was that given to the Jews? When was it given to Moshe Rabbeinu? And the Talmud in Tractate Gittin 60a, shares with us the following. Text number 2 in your handout. We have this argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Reish Lakish says, Mount Sinai, Moshe received the completed Torah. He received the entire 5 books of Moses. Rabbi Yochanan says no. At Mount Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu received just the stories up until there. He received, of course, Exodus. He received parts of Genesis, the story of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The story of the descent into Egypt. He received the beginning of Exodus. But past the story of the giving of the Torah, Moshe didn't see that at Mount Sinai. Could you imagine? At Mount Sinai, while Moshe is on the mountain, God tells him how he's going to hit a rock, and then he's going to hit another rock and won't be able to enter into to Israel, and how there's going to be this story with Korach and the pit is going to open. Moshe knew the future. Rabbi Yochanan says no. He didn't know. As stories happened, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down all of these details. Let's talk for a moment about the day of Moshe's passing. 40 years later, in the year 2488, on the 7th day of Adar, Zayin Adar, Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. He passed away at Chatzois, midday. So let's say the day began at 6 a.m. and midday, approximately 12 noon, 6 hours. Throughout these 6 hours, we could learn a major lesson from Moshe. These last 6 hours of his life, what did he do? Number one, he wrote 13 Torah scrolls. Number two, he went ahead and he said the second to last Torah portion, the song of Ha'azinu Hashemayim Va'adaber, the second to last portion of the Torah, he told to the Jewish people on that day. And finally, at noon, Moshe Rabbeinu, our master Moses, he went onto the mountain of Nevo, Har Nevo, and he's buried there. Interestingly enough, the Torah tells us no one will ever find the burial site of Moshe. If you go to the top of the mountain of Nevo, you'll think he's on the bottom. If you go to the bottom of the mountain of Nevo, you'll think he's on the top. No one will ever find that. But what we see is Moshe had 12 hours left, and yet he used it out to above its maximum. 13 Torah scrolls. He spoke to the Jewish people, said over this message of Ha'azinu. Additionally, perhaps he prayed a little bit. Perhaps he ate something. But just to imagine how all of this time, these few hours were used out in its maximum. And now is when ideally trouble should begin. Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, a new leader comes, and this leader did not talk to God. He did not receive the Torah on Mount Sinai. So how should he know what to go ahead and do? Remember, all that was given, as we mentioned before, on Mount Sinai was the mitzvos with their details. Nothing else was given. The Talmud was not given, the Mishna was not given. How should Joshua, Yoshua, the next leader of the Jewish people, how would he know how to continue and lead the Jewish people? I was in Australia. I was working in the yeshiva in Melbourne, Australia. And I became an acquaintance with a man who earlier on in his life had been in a cult. And one of the practices of this cult was that every morning they would wake up and they would say words that weren't cohesive. They would say things that didn't make any sense. And later on in his life, when he returned to his Jewish heritage, he saw that one of these things they used to say was the 13 methods of how the Torah could be expounded upon. The Yud Gimel Midois She'aTorah Nidreshes Bahem. When the Torah was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai, God also gave Moshe Rabbeinu, 13 methods through how to expand upon and derive certain things from the Torah. And if you read them simply, they make no sense. If you have a general rule and a specific rule, if you have a specific rule and a general rule, if you have a general rule and a specific rule, followed by a general rule, on the outset, it makes no sense. But yet when he returned to his Jewish heritage, he saw that what he was saying every day was actually these 13 principles. And these 13 principles were the method that Joshua, Yoshua, the leader of the Jewish people, after Moshe Rabbeinu, was able to know how to continue and how to further the Jewish people. What happens if there's an argument? There's always arguments. We say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Well, how are you going to work that out? What happens when you have an argument? There's 2 things. that everyone knew then, two things we know today. I had a discussion a while back with the rabbi, and the rabbi, he was arguing with me, he was complaining. How could it be, he says, that the authors, the people who compiled, or to be precise, the people who concluded, this didn't include certain stories. The last part of scriptures is the Book of Esther, the famous story of Purim. But he says, how do they choose? How do they know what to do? And he was telling me how they really should have inserted this certain story. Now, that whole premise doesn't make sense, and that's what I wanted to share with you, because everyone knows when you want to go ahead and study the Torah, there are two principles you need to know. Number one, the previous generations are always correct. The closer you were to Moshe Rabbeinu, the more knowledge you had, you're correct. For example, in our times, I think it's similar in most judicial systems. If a person has a question today in halakha and Torah law, what do? We go and look. In our previous generations, perhaps there's a story similar to ours, which could give us insight how to rule. So these two details are how till today we work with argument. Number one, we know that the previous generations are correct. And number two, we go after the majority. If there's an argument, like we had that story of Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer with the oven, if there's an argument, then we go after the majority. And like this, the Jewish people are able to continue and always know how to act when. Again, I want to repeat, if there's any questions, please email them to classes@jnet.org, classes@jnet.org. For 1,000 years, from the time the Torah was given until approximately 2,000 years ago, there were no Torah books aside for the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. And yet today, we have thousands. If you go to the sheer number of books that are printed, Torah books, there's millions upon millions of Torah books printed. Why was there a time when they were not printed? And what happened now that they are printed? And the truth is, the question is really backwards. And we'll see that in a second. If you look in text number 3 in your handout, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, he says, write for yourself these words, for on the basis of these words I have established a covenant with you. Write for yourself the Torah. The Torah is my covenant. The Torah is my promise. This is our connection. But if we look deeply, the words contradict each other. Write for yourself these words. Write, that means you need to write it down. But the verse continues, for on the basis of these words, in Hebrew, al-pi, by the mouth of these words. And the Talmud says, that means the verse starts off saying, write for yourself, write it. And the verse continues, on the basis, by the mouth of these words, meaning that they should not be written. So you're telling me at the beginning of the verse to write it down, and then you continue not to write it down? How does that work? Well, it's a good question. And of course, our rabbis dealt with it. You can look at text number 4 in the Talmud in Temura, 14b. Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, he shared with us a teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. And it's a very scary teaching, very scary. And if we think about how we act today, perhaps we need to refocus. He says, those who write down the laws of the oral Torah are like those who burn the Torah. And one who studies from these manuscripts gains no reward. If you go ahead and you write down the oral Torah, those manuscripts need to be burned. If someone learns from your manuscripts, they haven't learned anything. There's no reward. Rabbi Yochanan is telling us. The verse in text number 3 is saying, write for yourself the 5 books of Moses, Torah Moshe. Keep oral. On the basis of these words, al-pi, keep oral, the oral Torah. Everything else aside for Tanakh, everything else aside for the writing, for the Torah, the script, the writings in the scriptures, everything else should be oral. Wow. We have millions of Torah books printed today, and seemingly you're telling me that all of those books need to be gathered together and burned. Unfortunately, the Jewish people have lived through eras where our books were taken and burned. We actually talk about some of these days when the books were burned on the 9th day of Av, the saddest day of the year. We talk about these sad tragedies when our books were burned, but I don't understand. There's no tragedy. They need to be burned, says the Talmud in Tractate Tamura. And the Talmud continues in text number 5, and it says no. It says, I have a problem with your statement. You're telling me I'm not allowed to write down the Torah? But if there were 2 rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, Reb Shimon ben Lakish, who they would read a book of Agadah, they would read a book of the Talmud on Shabbos. 1 second. But you told me you're not allowed to write down a book of Talmud. And yet you're telling me that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish read a book of Talmud. How did this work together? And the Talmud continues. They expanded, again, we're in text number 5, they expounded a verse to justify their actions thus. A time to act for Hashem, nullify your Torah. They said, it is preferable that 1 letter of the Torah be uprooted so that the Torah itself should not be forgotten from Israel. Essentially meaning, if the whole Torah is going to be forgotten because we won't write it down, if from not writing it down, we won't have any method of learning, then we're actually doing a lack. We're actually ruining the Torah by not writing it down. And better that we change a small detail of not writing it down than forget the whole Torah. But why? What happened all of a sudden 2,000 years ago that the Torah then had to be written down more than ever before? What specifically happened? There was 1,000 years prior from the Torah was given till the Torah was written down, the oral Torah. There was 1,000 years, which then the Torah wasn't written. So what happened after 1,000 years? And tragically, there are 3 things that started taking place at that time. Number 1, unfortunately, there were many more arguments than previously. Machloikis, argument had begun. Very unfortunate, very sad. Second of all, unfortunately, the sheer number of Talmudic scholars also decreased. There weren't as many Talmudic scholars as the previous generations. And last, but perhaps the most important is, as you could see on your map, at the time 2,000 years ago, the Jewish people started leaving from Israel and heading to Iraq. Modern day Iraq is Babylonia. They started Babylonia. And because of that, because of this split in the Jewish tradition, there were some Jewish leaders in Israel, some in Babylonia. We would have different answers for different things. We needed to have a basis of law where everyone, all over the world, would be able to look and say, 1 second, let's have the same Torah. Let's have the same laws. Not that someone living in Iraq should have a different law than someone living in Alexandria, someone living in Tunis, someone living in America. Everyone should have the same law. And in order to do that, it was necessary at this time to write down the Torah. Let's stop for a moment and take some questions. Again, if you have any questions, please email them to classes@jnet.org. We have over here a fabulous question, fantastic question. The question reads, why could we change one detail of the Torah, the fact of writing down the Torah when it's not allowed to be written, the oral Torah, and yet other details of the 613 mitzvot can't be changed? It's a fantastic question. The truth is, it's something that many people have asked, and it's an obvious question. But the answer lies in what is the discussion at hand. We could look, there are a few times where we say that you're allowed to take something that we were taught and change it. And all of those things have a common denominator. They have a common theme. And therefore, because of that common theme, in all of those cases, we were allowed to go ahead and change them for the benefit of the Torah, but no other parts of the Torah, God forbid, could ever be changed. And if they are changed, it's not the Torah. One of the 13 principles of faith. Again, questions, classes at jnet.org. So let's go now. Who actually compiled the Talmud? The Talmud itself was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. If you want to go ahead and look inside of your handout, on the back page, you could actually look. There's a letter D. The letter D says next to it, Beis Sha'arim. And over there, that is where he actually compiled the Mishna. And actually over there is where he is buried. Who was he? He lived 80 years. Who was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince? He lived 80 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. At age 30, he becomes leader of the entire Jewish people, young man. And at that point, because of the aforementioned reasons, whether it's because of the increase in argument, because there were fewer Talmidei Chachamim, whether it's because people had started spreading out from one place, from Israel all the way throughout the world, he took the responsibility to gather. He sent messengers throughout all the cities where Jewish people lived, and he asked them to gather together any information people have about the Torah that was passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu. He took all of these writings that he received, and with that, he authored the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah. At this time, the leadership of the Jewish people primarily lived in Israel. But following his passing, Rav, the leader of the Jewish people that would take over after the passing of Judah the Prince, traveled from Beis Sha'arim to to Neharda. He traveled to, as you could see, about mid-Iraq. And that is how the Babylonian Talmud began. There are two Talmuds. There's the Israeli Talmud, and there is the Babylonian Talmud. Now, how do we have such a thing? The Talmud is an explanation of the Mishnah, the compilation of Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The Talmud is a compilation of discussions on the Mishnah. But how do we have two separate Talmuds, the Israeli Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud? How did that happen? You know, the Israeli Talmud is called actually the Jerusalem Talmud, Talmud Yerushalmi. Interesting to note, it was actually not compiled in Jerusalem. It was actually compiled in one of the holy cities, Tiberia. It was completed. You could actually see it on your paper. It was completed right behind the D in the map. There's an orange letter behind that. That's Caesarea. It was completed actually on the coastal city. But how do we have these two different Talmuds? And the answer lies when we mentioned before that the Jewish people started traveling. And there wasn't this method. We didn't have the internet then. We didn't have mail. We didn't have the postal service. And so there wasn't a lot of communication between the two. And the leaders, the Talmudic rabbis, the Talmudic authorities in Babylonia had their own discussions. The rabbis in Israel had their own discussions, and each one of them compiled their own Talmud. Unfortunately, because of persecution, the Jerusalem Talmud was never complete. It ended abruptly without completion 100 years prior to the completion of the Babylonian Talmud. I see we have a few more questions. Again, the questions are classes@jnet.org. Question number 1. We have a question that in source number 4, it seems that every Gemara begins with the question. How does this Gemara on its own answer this question? Every Gemara begins with the Mishnah. Very good point. This is actually a tremendous point, and I appreciate the person asking it. It kind of leads me into the next topic, and that is that the Talmud does not only discuss the Mishnah. Literally, if you learn the Talmud, you can see the Talmud goes on tangents. So, in the middle of a discussion about what the Mishnah was saying, all of a sudden the rabbis could go on to another discussion about a very vital and important topic. And perhaps that is the same in our Talmud we're discussing in Tamura 14b. Thank you again. Please go ahead and feel free to send in your questions. So we've discussed, you have the Jerusalem Talmud, you have the Babylonian Talmud, but as always, there's difference of opinion. The Jerusalem Talmud rules one way, the Babylonian Talmud rules another way. Again, they didn't have that method of communication. So when you learn the Talmud, you're completely confused. Which Talmud should you follow? Well, the answer is the Babylonian Talmud. If you have a contradiction between the Israeli and Babylonian, we go after the Babylonian Talmud, which is very troubling. Text number 6. Out of Zion shall the Torah come forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, u'devar Hashem Yerushalayim. From Zion, from Israel, is Torah. The Talmud tells us, Avira deretz Yisrael machakim, the air of Israel. Just breathing the air makes you smart. So how could it be that the Babylonian Talmud takes precedence over the Jerusalem Talmud? Israel should come first. Out of Zion, out of Israel, shall the Torah come forth. And yet I'm telling you now, out of Babylonia shall the Torah come forth. And again, the answer lies in what we mentioned earlier, that in Israel, unfortunately, because of the Roman persecution at the time, there was no peace of mind. And the majority of Torah scholars left. And because in Babylonia we had the exact opposite. First of all, we had tranquility, peace of mind. And second of all, we had the majority of Torah scholars. Therefore, the law follows the Babylonian Talmud, as is famously known, the Talmud Bavli. Who compiled the Talmud? Who's I won't say author of the Talmud, because the Talmud there's no author. It's rather someone compiled the different discussions that were had. And who is that man? Rav Ashi. 14 years old. Rav Ashi at 14 years old, he enters into the yeshiva of his teacher, Rava. He then becomes Rosh Yeshiva in a city called Sura. He becomes the leader of the Talmudic seminary. And only towards the end of his life does he begin to compile and gather together the Talmud. Unfortunately, he passed away without completing his dream. And two people stepped in. One, his son, Mar, the son of Rav Ashi, and Ravina, they stepped in and they completed this monumental work that Rav Ashi had begun. So we've discussed what Moshe Rabbeinu received at Mount Sinai. We then continued on how the Torah there's two opinions when the Torah itself was complete. We discussed how generations to come could innovate in Torah, how they should deal with argument. And we understand now the foundations of the Mishna and the Talmud. But how did it come to be that from Israel and Babylonia, all of a sudden the Jewish people traveled west? How did that happen? And when did it happen? As you see, the major Torah centers in Morocco, in Spain, when did this all happen? The fact that Jewish people, just to preface, the fact that Jewish people had been going to those places on their own is not a big deal. They went on their own. The question is, how do the centers of Torah all of a sudden get to these areas? And the story takes us back 1,000 years ago to the year 4,720, 9,600 in the Common Era. 4 great rabbis are sailing from Bari, Italy. You could actually see it on the map by the letter F. And they were going to a wedding together of one of their friends' children. Unfortunately, as we all know at that time, there were a lot of pirates. One of the worst pirates, one of the pirates that you tried to keep away from at all costs, was Ibn Rumais. And unfortunately, he took control of this boat with these 4 rabbis. He looks around at his booty, he looks around at his people, and he sees these rabbis. And as we all know, a Jew cares for another Jew, will do anything for another Jew. You look inside of our history and all the stories of persecution, when Jewish people were just being murdered, when they were being killed, and people had to run away from terror, the pogroms, the Cossacks, the Inquisition, another Jewish community, without knowing the people, would automatically allow these other foreign people into their homes, into their community. And whenever a Jew hears that another Jew is in pain, he's going to spend all money to help him. And Ibn Rumais knew that, and he took advantage, and he was going to charge astronomical amounts for each one of these rabbis. And he was traveling along the Mediterranean River, and his first stop is Alexandria, Egypt. Over there in Alexandria, he goes to the Jewish community, and he says, listen, I have this tremendous rabbi named Rabbi Shmarya. And I'm offering him for sale for this amount. And of course, the Jewish people put it together. And this Rabbi Shmarya was the foundation of the Talmudic, or not of the Talmudic, but was the foundation of the tremendous learning era of Alexandria, Egypt. Ibn Rumais continues with the additional 3 rabbis to Tunis. And over there, he takes the Rabbi Chushiel, and again, the same story, he sells him to the people in Tunis for this astronomical amount, and of course, they paid it. This Rabbi Chushiel, he lives now in Tunis, and while he is there, he teaches his son, which is going to become Rabbeinu Hananel, and another rabbi, Rabbeinu Nisim, and these 2 people are perhaps the first people to give full explanations on the Talmud. Rabbeinu Hananel, the son of Rabbi Chushiel, who at this point was just sold to the Jewish community in Tunis, they were students of Rabbi Chushiel. And the story, unfortunately, continues where Rabbi Moshe, together with his wife and son Enoi, were on the boat together with its Ibn Rumais. Ibn Rumais really wanted to marry the wife of Rabbi Moshe, and he was trying to convince her at all costs to become his wife. You know, one of the 3 cardinal sins is to commit adultery. And she turns to her husband, and she tells her husband, if I jump off of the boat right now, will I have a portion in the world to come? We know that a Jewish person is not allowed to commit suicide. And she says, if I jump off of the boat, will I have a portion in the world to come, or will it be considered committing suicide? Could you imagine? It's something unfathomable. Here we have Rabbi Moshe. His wife is asking him, should I commit suicide? It's impossible to imagine the emotions running now. And yet in a second, Rabbeinu Moshe says, he's quoting from Psalms, he's quoting from Tehillim, and he says, Ashiv mi metzulais yam. God clearly says, I will bring back from the depths of the sea. He says, absolutely. Absolutely. That is, if you're going to commit suicide now, you're doing a holy thing. And immediately she jumps off the boat and dies. Moshe is broken. His son is broken. And they don't despair. They don't give up. Even Rumayas then takes them to Spain and the Jewish community. Again, the same story happens in Cordova, Spain. They buy Rabbi Moshe for an astronomical amount, and he joins their community. Now, Rabbi Moshe and his son Enoch, they were tremendous Torah scholars, but they were also extremely humble. And when they come to this new community, they didn't want to disturb the community. The community already had a rabbi, Rabbi Nassan, and they didn't want to disturb it. And they just would come to the local lectures, and they would listen in from the lectures of the rabbi. And then one day something happened that changed the whole story. One day Rabbi Nassan, the rabbi, is giving a talk. And he made a mistake. He made a halachic mistake. He made a mistake in his ruling of Torah law. And we know when you make a mistake in the ruling of Torah law, there's no such thing as humility. People that are aware of the issue need to go ahead and talk to the rabbi. And that is that day, where Moshe went ahead and talked and spoke to Rabbi Nassan. And he tells him, he says, Rabbi Nassan, I understand that you rule this way, but doesn't the Torah say such and such? And Rabbi Nassan listens and he's astounded. He says, of course, you're 100% correct. He says, you're so smart. You're such a Torah scholar. I'm sitting down. You are becoming the rabbi of this city. And that is eventually what happened. He became, at this point, Rabbi Moshe became the rabbi of Cordoba, Spain. And that allowed Cordoba to become this major center of Torah. And thus, the famous Torah scholars of the Even Ezra, the Rimigash, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, author of the Kuzari. And of course, we all know Cordoba, Spain is famous for Maimonides, for the Rambam. Thus, all of these people came to Cordova, Spain at the head that began with the help of Rabbi Moshe. It's an interesting lesson. Rabbi Moshe, remember, he saw his wife commit suicide. And he came to create the center of Torah learning. Cordova, Spain will never be forgotten for what it has shared within our history. This story, it's an unfortunate story, but at the same time, it was a godly story. In order to allow that the Jewish people within these areas, throughout the Western Hemisphere at that time, should have Torah scholars and should become centers of Torah learning, God allowed the story of these four rabbis to be captured to happen. Again, I want to remind you, if there's any questions, classes at jnet.org. This is an interactive class, and we'd love to hear your questions. Who is Rashi? Famous Rashi. With the birth of Rashi, there are two tremendous stories. Number one, why his parents were chosen to be the parents of Rashi. And second of all, how Rashi's mother was almost murdered while pregnant with Rashi, and a miracle happened. Why were his parents chosen to have Rashi? Well, his father at one point had this tremendous diamond, the diamond worth a tremendous amount. And people wanted the diamond for not good things, inappropriate things. And the last thing that Rashi's father would want, or wanted, was that this diamond should get in the hands of inappropriate places, inappropriate people. And instead, he rather took the diamond and got rid of it. And as a reward for that, his parents were deserving of having a son, Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki. Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki was born in the year 4800 in the town of Troyes, France, Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchak. When his mother was pregnant with Rashi, she was walking through her town, And as you know, in ancient cities, you could see that the walkways are very small. And she was walking, and here came this man on a horse running past her and almost ran her down. He didn't have value for life then. He was about to run her down, and a miracle happened where the place she was standing actually indented and made room for her to move in. And thus, she was able to be, her life was spared, and of course, Rashi was born. At age 33, listen to this, 33 years old, Rashi goes into exile. It's unbelievable to imagine he does this by foot, presumably. He goes throughout Italy from France. He goes Italy, Greece, Israel, Egypt, Germany. He does this major journey throughout, the common world at that time. Rashi himself wrote his explanations on the Talmud 3 times. Wow, it's a lesson for us. When we're students, we go ahead and we answer tests in a second and we give them in, we barely look them over. Rashi, he wrote his explanation 3 times. Tremendous, tremendous lesson. Interesting to note, the first Jewish book ever printed was actually the explanation of Rashi. And unfortunately, in the year 4865, on the 29th day of Tammuz, age 65, a young man, Rashi, passes away. I want to share with you this most awesome piece. Again, I encourage you, if you have not seen the handout, to please go ahead and print it out. But I want to share with you now a piece from the Talmud. If you could look at the Talmud on the left-hand side, there are 3 lines that have an orange box around them. And let me quote to you those 3 lines. Incredible. They read like this. Rabbeinu gufo tahor. Rabbeinu, our master, Rashi, his body is pure. V'yatsa nishmaso b'tahara. His soul left his body in purity. Lo pirish yoser. He didn't write anymore. At this point, exactly as I'm going to show you in one moment, he passed away. He didn't continue his explanation. Mikan ve'elech lishon talmido, Rabbi Yehuda bar Nassan. From here and on, any explanation you have in this tractate of Makos is not from Rashi himself. It's actually from his student, Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Nassan. What is this saying here? I want you to look, if you could look, 1 line prior. You'll see the second word of the line says Rachat Tahor. The second word of the line is Tahor. Rashi was in the middle of writing that word Tahor when he passed away. What does Tahor mean? Tahor means pure. He was in the middle of writing the word pure in Tractate of Makos when he passed away. And therefore they wrote over here that Rashi, his body is pure and his soul left while writing purity. What could be greater than that? Who was Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Nassan, who continued the Rashi after the passing of Rashi himself? So let's now look at the second box, right under in the second page of your handout. In the second section, you could actually see a family tree of Rashi, and we'll discuss this more at length in a few moments, but here you see that Rashi had 3 daughters, and each one of his daughters married one of those people. The first one is, we have Rabbeinu Meir ben Reb Shmuel, we have Rabbi Yehuda bar Nassan, and Rabbeinu Ephraim. These 3 people were his son-in-laws. So actually, Rabbi Yehuda bar Nassan, who was also a student, eventually became his son-in-law, and he continued the Rashi in Tractate Makos from where Rashi himself had passed away. Rashi, in numerous places, is called, and this is a question, as you can see on the handout, explanation of the notes. Explanation of the notes, that's a very funny name. If you want to go and write a fascinating name to attract people, perhaps you'll write $1 million questions. But explanation of the notes is not going to be too attractive. Where did he get this name? Why did he get this name? Explanation of the notes. Rashi was a humble man. And in the beginning, he would go from town to town, city to city, and he would listen in, he would eavesdrop to all the Talmudic discussions. And he heard many people had questions. And every night, he would write down the answer to those questions and insert them into the Talmud of the Rebbe, of the teacher in that place. And the next morning, the teacher would come and he would see this most fascinating, eye-opening, wonderful answer to the previous day's question. And he did this in many places for a while. And that is where he got the name Explanation of the Notes, because people would wake up one morning and they were hoping to have an explanation of the notes. They were looking forward, they were hoping, please, that someone would insert a note into their Gemara with the answer to their questions. And eventually it became known that these were notes from the one and only Rashi. We'll take now a few questions. Again, classes at jnet.org. A few questions. Fascinating question. Rabbi, this isn't exactly what you're covering, but perhaps related. However, please disregard if it's too far off the topic. Not at all. Listen to this question. I once heard Rashi did not write in Rashi's script as we know it. Is this true? And if so, when and who decided to print Rashi in the script as we know it today? In other words, the famous Rashi script, not the original Ashuri script, which we attribute to Rashi, the name of it is Rashi script. The question is, was it written by Rashi? And the answer is no. Rashi, you're correct. That's a good question. Rashi did not write in Rashi script. Okay, so why was Rashi script created? If you have 100 people that are dressed exactly the same height, and they look similar, you won't be able to differentiate one from the other. And the printer of the Talmud, they figured that if they're just going to have too many different types of writing on the same page, it's just going to get messy. So for that reason, in order to differentiate the center text, the text of the Talmud itself, from the outer text, the text of Rashi, and later on the text of Tosfos, they made a different font. But it's a good question. Rashi text was not written by Rashi. Thank you very much. Who were the Tosfos? So after Rashi, we have Tosfos. If you look at your handout, so on the top, I see it's very blurry in the camera, okay. But if you look on your handout, so on the left-hand side of the Gemara page is Rashi. On the right-hand side is Tosfos. Who are Tosfos? Well, the answer really is the last question of the previous page of the handout. Question, Tosfos means addition. Addition to what? Tosfos in Hebrew means to be mosif, addition. That's a funny name again for a book. Tosfos edition. No one's going to buy this book. Why was it called edition? Well, that's exactly the key. Tosfos is an addition to Rashi. Rashi wrote on the Talmud, and Tosfos commented on Rashi. Just to understand it better, look at the family tree on the second half, on the second page of the handout. And you'll see that Rashi had a son-in-law on the right named Rabbeinu Meir ben Reb Shmuel. Rabbeinu Meir ben Reb Shmuel had 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. As you can see, he had Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. He had the Rivam, Rabbeinu Tam. He had a daughter, and the daughter had Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shmuel. When we say Tosfos, essentially, it originated by Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Meir, the Rashbam, who's a grandson of Rashi, together with Rabbeinu Tam, again a grandson of Rashi, with the help of their nephew, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shmuel, the Rihazake, the great-grandson of Rashi. So the authors of Tosfos began as grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Rashi. They were an addition. They were trying to understand better, what does Rashi mean? How is Tosfos compiled? This itself is a lesson. If you want to organize something, how to do it. Rabbeinu Tam, who as you see was the third child of Rabbeinu Meir ben Reb Shmuel, he gathered together 60 Talmudic scholars. One scholar from each tractate. The Talmud Bavli, has 60 volumes, and he got one person who was completely fluent in each tractate of the Talmud. He sat them all down. And now, if anyone ever had a question, so each tractate was able to share what their tractate shared on that matter. So for example, if you look in Tosfos at any point, it will say 1 second. How could the Talmud in Brachot say one thing, but the Talmud in Makos says another thing? There's a constant array of questions from one tractate to the other, and that is because Rabbeinu Tam, as we mentioned, gathered these 60 Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, and whenever a piece of Talmud was discussed and learned, they were able to see how that worked with the rest of the Talmud. Let's summarize, and with this we'll conclude. And again, if there's any questions, please, now is your chance to email it to classes@jnet.org. Again, that's classes@jnet.org. We started off discussing what was given at Sinai, how only the mitzvot of the Torah were given, and not the Talmud, not the Mishna, not the explanations on the Torah. We continued how the Torah itself was completed, whether it was given complete at Mount Sinai, whether it was complete at the time that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. We discussed how following that, if there's a conflict, we go after the majority, and the previous generations are always correct. We continued to discuss how the Jewish people started moving from Israel, and therefore it was necessary to write down the Torah, the oral Torah, which was forbidden prior. It was necessary to write it down. And finally, we concluded discussing the authors of the Mishna itself, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Talmud, Rav Ashi. We discussed the 4 rabbis which were kidnapped on this boat and thus were taken to become leaders of Jewish communities. We concluded with Rashi and now an understanding of who and what Tosfos is. I'd like to wish each and every one of you to have a wonderful, wonderful Shavuot when we'll receive the Torah. Every year, the receiving of the Torah gets greater and greater, bigger and bigger. Please take the opportunity to receive the Torah in Shul together with the congregation. Have that Sinai experience. And before I conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. And of course, to thank JNet and Chabad.org for making this possible. Thank you very much. And each one of us should be blessed with good and happiness and everything we need. Good evening.